Hi, everybody, and welcome back or welcome to the last of the 14 lectures in race and technology from Microsoft Research. This has been an amazing series to organize, to be part of. I'm Nancy Boehm. I'm a Senior Principal Research Manager at Microsoft Research New England. I had the honor of organizing the series along with Charlton McElwain from New York University, Hannah Wallach from MSR, and also Christopher Morris from the Chief Marketing Office here. And I want to thank them, and I also want to thank the folks at Microsoft Research Outreach who have made this whole thing run. That includes Brittany Muller, Jessica Mastronardi, Eleanor Buxton, and my own lab director, Susan Dumay. And I really want to thank everybody who has spoken in the series and all of you for attending and asking great questions and being engaged. It's been a remarkable series. And if this is the first time you're tuning in, don't you worry, because the other 13 talks, every single one of which is amazing, are there waiting for you on YouTube, and you can access them with the registration you gave for this event today. The goal of this series has been to demonstrate the tremendous research value of bringing lenses of race, caste, and indigeneity to think about technology. And I think that over the course of this, we've seen that in just so very many domains. And in our final domain today, we're going to be looking at computing education. So it's our tremendous honor today to have Dr. Nicki Washington with us today. Dr. Washington is a professor of the practice of computer science at Duke University and the author of Unapologetically Dope: Lessons for Black Women and Girls on Surviving and Thriving in the Tech Field. She began her career in higher education at Howard University as the first Black female faculty member in the Department of Computer Science. She's also been at Winthrop University, the Aerospace Corporation, and IBM. She graduated from Johnson C. Smith University and North Carolina State University. And in another first, because she's a woman of many impressive firsts, she was the first Black woman to earn a PhD in computer science at the university, and also a 2019 Computer Science Hall of Fame inductee. She's from Durham, North Carolina, but today she's in Minneapolis getting ready to tour Paisley Park, but has graciously agreed to spend some time with us before then. So please join me in welcoming Nicki Washington. And I will be monitoring questions in the chat, so you don't have to wait till the end to offer them. But you can if you want. Look forward to talking with you all later. Thanks.
Greetings, everyone. My name is Nicki Washington, and I am a professor of the practice of computer science and gender, sexuality, and feminist studies here at Duke University. And before I get started today, I would like to take a moment to remember the victims of Uvalde, Texas, the victims of Buffalo, New York, and all of the other victims of mass shootings that have happened in this country over the last few weeks. Despite what many in computer science, including people and organizations, would have you believe, we do not exist in a vacuum, and these events that are happening in society are also impacting us in the ways that we engage in and use computing in this country. So, I'd like to begin this talk by talking about my motivation for the work I do and how I exist and move in spaces. And this picture here is of my maternal grandmother. She was born in South Carolina and spent all of her adulthood in rural Western North Carolina. And there's so much about my grandmother that I learned as a child growing up. She passed away when I was around 26. Uh, but one of the things that really stood out for me happened at her funeral. So, my grandmother, I knew, worked as a domestic for white families outside of the Asheville area in North Carolina. And at her funeral, my uncle, who gave her eulogy, stated a story about her one day when she fell ill and she could not go to work. And so my uncle, as a teenager, said that he would go to work for her that day so she didn't miss her pay. And he showed up at the white family's home and started on her list of daily chores that she was to do, one of which was mop the floor. So he found a bucket and a mop, and he began to mop the floor. And the white woman who owned the home came in and very quickly said, "Oh, no, 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 that's not how she mops." And he said, "Well, what do you mean?" And she said, Well, she gets a brush. She uses a brush and gets down on the floor and brushes the floor. And my uncle was infuriated and said that he told her in that moment, "My mother will never show back up at this house again." And that was the last day that she worked. And I use that story because so much of how she existed in the world was based on the fact that she grew up and spent so much of her life living through Jim Crow. And it made so much sense to me what I saw in terms of her interactions with people, and especially white women, as a child and even as a young adult. But this is not anything unfamiliar. So Patricia Hill Collins talks about the outsiders within in her work on Black feminist thought, and how Black women, domestic workers, existed in white families as outsiders within. And that phrase was coined to describe them originally because they sat at this unique position where they worked in these white homes, but they were not part of the white families. And so by existing there temporarily each day, they could see the contradictions between the ideologies that these white families had and the actual practices that they put forward, particularly the ways in which how white women existed racially did not map the same when it came to gender dynamics at home. But this was a very powerful um, phrase and way to describe this existence, because it also talked about the unique positionality that Black women had uh, in this space to understand oppression in ways that not even white women could understand. This was also supported by the work of Bell Hooks, who also talked about this quote: "Living as we did on the edge, we developed a particular way of seeing reality. We looked both from the outside in and the inside out. We focused our attention on the center as well as the margin. We understood both." And again, this positionality of always being at the margins, yet sometimes dipping in to the private lives of those at the center, allows Black women in these positions to understand things and nuances that are totally lost on anyone else who is not a Black woman. Now, this doesn't really seem like it may make sense in the context of computer science, and why in the world am I talking about this right now? But I ask that you stay with me for a minute, because this will all make perfect sense as we start to go into some of the other parts of this discussion. So, as we've talked about technology in recent years, we've seen, even the last 2 years, a total shift in the way that the community at large, the computer science community and greater society, recognizes the harms that are now the result of technology, when the mantra has been fail fast, fail often, get things out quickly, iterate, etc. And these are just some of the recent headlines, not all of them, but some that have stood out over the last couple of years. So, just in the last couple of weeks, there has been renewed conversations around additional reports of sexual assault in the metaverse. This was first reported a couple of years ago, or a year ago, I'm sorry, when Facebook first released Metaverse. But then there's also Clearview AI and the conversations that are being had around facial recognition technology being used in schools. Also, surveillance technology being used in schools. And one of the most scary things that I think that has surfaced in the last couple of weeks is this idea of actually placing tasers on drones to harness them and use them around schools as a layer of protection. But then we also see things around how facial recognition will be used for financial technologies as well, and even the ways that this financial technology is still discriminating against applicants based on their race and or ethnicity. And so, of course, there's a lot of conversations around how do we address this problem. And the usual solution is we need to diversify the tech space. And yes, we need to diversify the tech space, but that is a very oversimplified solution to the problem. So, some of the other traditional solutions to the problem, if we have to diversify the tech space, that means that we need to go back into the academic spaces as well as K 12, in addition to post secondary, and find ways to make sure that more students from minoritized groups, in this case, I'll talk about race and ethnicity specifically, get more students into computer science degrees and ultimately careers. Now, one of the ways that also helps to address this problem is more technology. That's often been the case and the answer for people. And we see how more technology and this idea of techno chauvinism creates a world of problems, like we just saw on the last slide. But when it comes to the actual students, there are additional ways to solve this problem: scholarships, mentoring and bridge programs, affinity groups, special panels and workshops dedicated to insert identity in computing, action forums and town halls, X-only programs where this may be Girls Who Code, for example, or something that is specifically designed for students who identify as Latina or Black or Indigenous, and then role models and campaigns. So what we see is that we're arming all of the students with all of these different types of efforts and interventions that pour into them. But there's a question that we need to be asking. Now, in computing, we often talk about verification versus validation. So verification asks, are we doing the job right? So we're usually testing to make sure that we're meeting the specifications and requirements. But then validation asks, are we doing the right job? And I would answer that the response is no, we're not doing the right job. Because while we're pouring into all of those students through these programs dedicated to young women and girls, or Black girls, Indigenous girls, Latina girls, etc., we end up still with the following situations that are happening in computing and greater STEM environments. Black in the Ivory, which was a hashtag created in the summer of 2020, spotlighted how Black students, faculty, and staff experience white supremacy across colleges and universities that are predominantly white. And it shed light on a lot of the common experiences that we have. And as a result of that, a lot of the researchers in that community and the greater STEM community committed to shutting down STEM for a day and learning more from their Black colleagues and students. Well, the problem is that's just a day. So what do you do after that? But then we also saw companies starting to talk about these commitments to racial equity and this investment. And one of the ones that stood out, for example, was Google and the commitments to racial equity. But then at the same time, we were still learning that, or some of us were reminded that there were policies in place at these companies that were directly rooted in white supremacy. For example, badge policing was something that Google CEO acknowledged they would be doing away with in the summer of 2020. But the problem is, for years, for decades even at this point, there were complaints by Black and Latinx employees and interns of being badge policed, which was essentially where any Google employee could walk up to another Google employee and then ask to see their badge to make sure that people were in spaces where they belonged. Now, if you think of this historically, we see that this sounds very similar to some of the policing that happens in communities where people are calling the cops on individuals for trying to get into their home or visiting a new home for sale, for example. So this does not, again, exist in isolation. We're seeing this and how it plays out in society and its replication in these environments. But then we fast forward to December of 2020 and we learned about Dr. Timnit Gebru's firing and all of the things that happened to her as a result of that. And then we kept going to January 6th, and GitHub actually fired a Jewish employee who on Slack notified colleagues to be aware of Nazis. And the complaints that centered around his use of the term Nazis and how offensive that was in Slack, even though the individuals he noted who were at the January 6th insurrection were calling themselves Nazis. But then we even fast forward a little bit further and we found that there were computer science faculty who were accused of sexual harassment and how this had a history of allegations in departments and how that was impacting women who were students as well as postdocs and faculty. And then we learned about the ways in which Black workers at Coinbase were feeling tokenized and experiencing white supremacy as well. And then, even finally, we started to learn about how the implementation or the re implementation of DoorDash's We Dash policy, where once a month, all all DoorDash employees, including the CEO, were required to actually do runs and use the technology as a delivery driver once a month, and how the complaints came out that, well, if I'm an engineer, software engineer making $400,000 a year, I shouldn't have to be expected to do this once a month. So these show that we're still not doing the right job, because if we pour into all of these students who have minoritized identities like we see here, then they still have to show up and deal with people, policies, and practices that impact them. So we've taken all of our attention and focused it in on the students and told them, armor up, be stronger, have more grit, have more resilience. And then we push them back into environments where people, policies, and practices are designed to harm them. Now, I'm going to take a moment as well because I want to acknowledge something that literally just happened 1 hour before I recorded this call. There was a situation with a group, the Papaya Project of Early Career Researchers, who were giving a work in progress talk as part of ACM SIGCAS, Computers and Society Group. And that Zoom call was open to the public, and everyone was excited to hear from this group of early career researchers on how the CS education and computing education research community could do a better job protecting and uplifting and advocating for minoritized and marginalized scholars. And what happened was we got on the Zoom call. They were not protected, they being the speakers, nor the audience. Zoom was not properly set by the SIGCAS leadership such that it prevented Zoom bombing. So immediately we were hit with violence in the form of porn, in the form of people who were unmuting themselves and screaming out obscenities, typing them into the chat. And then we also had to deal with a SIGCAS leader running the Zoom call who not only could not figure out how to manage this and address it in 2022, 2 years after we've all been using Zoom literally every day, but then as the leaders and the speakers from Papaya's project, or the Papaya Project, excuse me, were telling him what to do to address this, a Black and Latino woman specifically, he was questioning what they were saying. So they noted, shut down this link. We're going to create a new one with a new link and create it as a webinar. We're also going to share it via Twitter. And his responses came, well, how is anybody going to reach that? How is anyone going to know how to find it on Twitter? Now, this is the leadership of the Computer and Society SIG, a group that we just heard was interested in all of us joining because it's more of the newer form SIGs and a great space for us to learn and commune with each other and work together. And here we are experiencing violence multiple times from Zoom bombers. So there's no protection there. But in addition to not being protected there, when a Black and Latino woman say, here's the solution to address this, they are then met with additional violence by being questioned as to what is the best way to do this. I say all of that to say that we are doing a terrible job in the greater CS education and CS community in protecting not only our minoritized scholars and researchers, but all of us, especially early career researchers. So again, as we keep saying, students who identify as X, armor up. We are creating or refusing to adjust people, policies, and practices that continue to harm them. So, what are some of these policies? Let's start with students. Some of them include entrance exams. Some departments still require, after students arrive, that they cannot declare a major until they get to the institution, have taken a couple of classes, and then are able to appropriately declare their major. This also applies for graduate students who are interested in pursuing PhDs, et cetera, in situations where certain entrance exams are given heavier weight than they should. In addition, requiring self-funded laptops often is a problem, especially if a student comes from a lower socioeconomic background and they cannot afford to purchase a laptop to pursue a major in computer science, yet an institution may not have dedicated lab space for them to then use computers as necessary to complete their coursework. This was especially true when we saw over the last 2 years of COVID how students were home a lot of the time and now may not have access to the technology that they would have on campus, but if they have access, it may be shared among other family members at home. But then there's also lack of funding that's available for students who are undocumented. Remember that we have a number of young people who are in our classrooms, in our departments, at our institutions who are undocumented, who want to learn, who want to thrive, and who are interested in doing research and TA positions and internships, but they are restricted because they are undocumented. And what does that mean when we are missing an entire demographic of young innovators who could be changing the world for the better? But it's not just the students who are experiencing these policy issues. And I want to note that this is not an exhaustive list. Faculty who hold these same identities are experiencing the same kind of challenges in different ways. So, under hiring and promotion and tenure policies, biased course evaluations often impact the trajectories of Black and Brown scholars in such harmful ways. H-index measures, which are used to define what is considered impactful in terms of research is another way that Black and Brown scholars end up harmed. Mainly because H-index measures is measured by your citation count. So who's citing you? Well, there's research that demonstrates, one, that minoritized scholars often do research that's relevant to them based on their identities. Well, that means that if that research is not uplifted and valued as research, then who's citing them becomes very limited and skewed. And then the circle of senior faculty with higher H-index measures continue to cite each other and do work together, which continues to amplify them as the leaders and experts in the field. And like I just said, limited perspectives on what counts as research. There are a lot of scholars who are interested in doing work that is impactful and meaningful to them, like I mentioned, but they're often skewed and steered away from that because you have to focus on getting promotion and tenure, as you're often told as an early career researcher. But why is that? Why can we not define or redefine what is considered impactful and what's considered research? Because there's so much that we don't know, as social scientists are telling us every single day in computing. There's all of these ways in which computer science and the technologies that we develop continue to cause harm to people. Why are we not in computer science valuing the research that comes from within our community from minoritized scholars who are interested in doing this work and who have the lived experience that allows them to see uniquely the blind spots that others don't see? Now, in addition to policies, and I want to note people as well, because I did not have a slide for that. So the people that I'm talking about who impact students as well as faculty end up being other students, other faculty, as well as staff and leadership. But the practices that tend to impact students in negative ways is inaccessible course material. This can be inaccessible in terms of ability to pay for it. For example, if you're thinking about textbooks that have ridiculous prices, it can also mean things like the inability to turn on captioning in Zoom when we were all again learning and working remotely. And so students who require closed captioning may not have that option. There's also inaccessible office hours because we don't think about, one, students who can get to and from our offices, the times that we schedule them. There are also students who may be working, for example, and that impacts how much a student can come to office hours and get the extra help if needed. And it also impacts even if students understand what office hours means. Dr. Anthony Jack talks about this a lot in The Privileged Poor, how so many students, especially from first generation college students, don't have any understanding of what office hours is based on its definition and think often that it's when faculty are in their office working not to be disturbed. No culturally relevant curricula. So nothing that speaks to the students and their identities. Inequitable TA selection. Remember, I just talked about the ways in which even students who identify as undocumented don't have the ability to be TA positions or BTAs because they can't be paid. So what does that mean? When you already have excluded a demographic of students who could actually provide benefit and belonging to their peers, but also who gets to be selected as a TA in general. So is it the student who raises their hand the most and participates? Is it traditionally the white and Asian students? And how many students from minoritized identities like Black, Brown, Latine, disabled, for example, how many students are we intentionally making sure we put in front of students to serve as leaders? Being asked to shoulder all of the diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts, but then also being hit with a ton of macroaggressions. And I never call these microaggressions because these are never micro. Campus policing, so being questioned about, do you belong here? Asked for a badge again, asked if you belong in a lab or classroom. And then tone policing. So always being told that whatever you're saying is angry or confrontational or that you're intimidating. And then being stereotyped by classmates as well as faculty and staff. I have had students who shared in class and also with me in office hours the ways in which people assume that because they are Black, that they are on campus and at the institution because of affirmative action. And these are questions that other students who identify as white are comfortable asking their peers with no shame. But on the flip side, again, we have faculty who are experiencing similar issues. So now faculty as well are being asked to shoulder all of the DEI efforts. However, they're not being elevated and amplified because of that work. In the greater CS education community alone, white scholars, particularly white women, are amplified and elevated as DEI experts. And there's research that has demonstrated this, from surveys that have been collected across the community to the awards that are given and beyond. Assumptions on qualifications. So being called Miss or Mr. rather than doctor or professor, and the ways in which correcting students is perceived as being confrontational or expecting some sort of deference, and even in times being called uppity. Inequitable pay. Macroaggressions again. And then, as you see, these are the same types of challenges that faculty as well as students are dealing with: campus policing, tone policing, and being stereotyped. So that means that as your students who move through these academic spaces are experiencing this harm, the faculty who hold the same identities are also experiencing it 9 times out of 10. Now, at this point, I want to give some personal experience to bring it back to the slide I showed with my maternal grandmother. So, to first help address some of these issues, I proposed probably around 2018 this class, race, gender, class, and computing. It was an idea that I had between 2018 and 2019 to really start trying to figure out how to save myself. So, what you see here on the right, this image was the result and the only set of responses I received as to why my promotion to full professor was denied at my prior institution. Now, it is typically not common for faculty to publicly share this information. However, I am very grateful that so many Black women, especially over the last 2 years, have started to make transparent the harms that they have experienced. And I'm sharing this because I know that there are other Black women and other brown women who will experience this same thing. But what you'll see here is that based on your performance at the rank of associate professor across teaching, research, and service, do you meet the qualifications for promotion? Now, where I was denied based on the fact that I did not meet the qualifications for promotion was under teaching. Specifically, as it states, I had challenges in this CSCI 101 course. This was an introductory service technology course that non-computing majors across the entire university had to take. It was a course that was team taught across our department. So I was just one of several professors in the department, about 7 or 8, who taught this course. However, I was the only person who was teaching two versions or two sections of this course per semester, which meant it heavily weighted the one course per semester that was my course for the major. Uh, as you'll see in here, students raise concerns about interactions which are sometimes viewed as being disrespectful. Research is provided pointing to race being a possible factor. Suggestion is work on one of the four dimensions of teaching behavior, adjusting teaching strategies based on class size, nature of the course, and variations in students. What this effectively says is that students found that I was disrespectful and rude. I provided research in my promotion packet that noted evidence stating that there's a ton of research around how women faculty are negatively criticized in course evaluations. This is even more true for Black women faculty who don't present as subservient enough to students, and also supported this in addition with the American Sociological Association's statement on the biases in course evaluations and how they impact minoritized faculty, especially when you have intersecting identities or intersectional identities. Here's an example of some of the responses that were on the qualitative feedback for these courses. Thinks she owns the place. No gratitude. Now, these are college students in a 100 level course who are making these comments about me. There were other comments that were made, for example, that I was disrespectful, I was rude, I was mean, I needed to be fired. And there were several students who even contradicted themselves, for example, saying, oh, she's extremely helpful. Anytime we have questions, she makes sure that she takes time in class to address all of them, to then saying, what is a suggested improvement? Making it more comfortable so that we can ask questions in class. But these are the ways in which harm is actually enacted upon faculty, specifically Black women faculty, and the ways in which we're not protected in our environments by our colleagues and our leadership. So my solution to this was to create my own course that would help to teach students about the ways in which what they're saying and doing and computing is replicated in society and how that's creating harm. Because these bias evaluations were provided to me and suggestions on improving my teaching were provided to me as if I needed to fix myself. For example, I was asked, well, how do we get students to like you, Nicki? And these are the kinds of ways in which Black women faculty continue to experience harm. There's historical context, like I talked about with being referred to as Mr. and Miss versus Dr. Professor. This used to be a serious issue with students because for some reason I was too uppity by asking students to refer to me as doctor or professor. But when I relayed this back in terms of Jim Crow and the ways in which Black people, including elders, were always required to give white people, including babies, a Miss or Mrs. honorific or Mr. honorific, but Black people were called boy, girl, or worse. Then it started to drive home the reasons why deference and familiarity don't always operate the same for Black faculty as they do white faculty. And I've had colleagues who've told me, well, I'm fine with students calling me by my first name. And I tell them, well, you have the privilege of doing that. I do not. And here's the historical context of why. So essentially, I was existing in that academic space and in just about any predominantly white academic space in computing as my own outsider within. Right? So I am now an outsider within in the same way that my grandmother served as an outsider within by working as a domestic in white homes, because computer science was never created for someone who looked like me. I was never supposed to be here. I was never supposed to be at Duke University as a professor. And so every place that I move remembering that I have a unique positionality and a unique responsibility to showcase and spotlight the harms that are being caused to me and others who look like me. But what is the cost of all of this misogynoir? Well, the first cost is time. And the time that is spent trying to prove that you belong and that you're supposed to be here and that someone has harmed you, and all of the meticulous ways that you need to document that harm to still then be questioned or doubted or denied and rejected. Then there's the cost in terms of financial gain. right? Because promotions, for example, impact career trajectories, which impact financial gain. So we talk about computer science being this space where people can create generational wealth. And that's supposed to be such a great plug to get more Black and brown students, especially, into the field. But how can we still say that when there is so much intention behind denying people access to promotions and potential career trajectories that will help elevate them and also generate that wealth that we keep talking about generationally? But then there's even the health issues that we could start to think about how it impacts people, from having to fight and always being in this position of defensiveness and always having to just be stressed out and filled with anxiety. I talk about what happened right before I got on this recording, and there's an anxiety that builds up in you, and that takes a toll on you physically and emotionally. So I've created this course. It's first rolled out in the fall of 2020 at Duke University, that Comp Sci 240 course. And in that time, there were a lot of other computer science faculty who were interested in creating similar courses. And they reached out and asked, well, what can we do? And can we borrow your course material? And I said no. One, because this was a course that required me to do a lot of self reflection, assessment, learning, as well as unlearning. Because even as a Black woman, and even with all of the ways that I have fought to be seen and to belong, there are still ways in which I caused harm to other students and other colleagues. And I needed to resolve that and acknowledge that and deal with that. And so, because I had to go through that process of learning and unlearning myself, it was important that anyone else who created a similar course did the same. Otherwise, you can create a world of harm. So, myself, as well as my colleague, Shawnee Daly, as well as my graduate student, Cicely Sadler, put together this program called the Cultural Competence in Computing Fellows Program, which is a 2-year cohort-based professional development program that brings together computing faculty, staff, and graduate students from across the globe to learn more about social science-related topics of identity and how that impacts the classrooms that we are creating and working in. And those topics, those 10 professional development sessions, coupled with reading material of books such as Racism Without Races, Race After Technology, Algorithms of Oppression, Technically Wrong, Teaching to Transgress, Sister Outsider, all of these books, Dark Matters, even bringing in all of these books from social scientists who have even been on this call, right? Dr. McElwain, Dr. Brown, Dr. Benjamin, all of them who are talking about how identity impacts and is impacted by computing, and making it make sense from a computer science perspective of how we can't just think about the technology. We have to think about the environments, and we have to change those. So we've been really excited because we created this space for learning and unlearning, for faculty, for staff, for graduate students. And we really try to leverage some of the lessons from bell hooks and teaching to transgress around the importance of this space in order to get faculty, especially white faculty, noting that almost 55% of computer science faculty across this country are white. So we have to find ways to make sure that white faculty and Asian faculty who dominate these spaces of computing understand all of these topics of identity, and then are able to tailor and create courses and modules within existing computing courses and other department activities that will help to create more identity inclusive spaces for students based on race, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, class, and ability, and more. So we're not just talking about race and ethnicity in these spaces. We want them understanding identity from a full context. We bring in guest speakers as well, in the first hour each of those 10 2-hour sessions, who are experts in these fields and also hold positionality. For example, Dr. Eduardo Bonilla Silva gave a talk on white supremacy. Dr. Jennifer Nash gave a talk on intersectionality. Dr. Rua Benjamin gave a talk on race and ethnicity. And then this year we had Dr. Lee Baker, Dr. Sophia Noble. So there are all of these ways that we are weaving in this important work around understanding the need for change and understanding the harm that is being caused, and how we cannot fix the technology until we fix the people who are creating the technology. So as a result of this year one Participants complete a prep packet as well as PD sessions. And then in year 2, they are designing and implementing these courses, modules, and activities that they are responsible for at their institution. We also encouraged participants to join and apply in teams, making sure that those teams included graduate students as well, because we didn't want any one person being responsible to go back to an institution with all of this institutional knowledge, because then it's another burden of DEI work. But also because we wanted to make sure that graduate students and postdocs had the opportunity to gain access to and partner on these projects as well. Because when they graduate, they fan out to other institutions as faculty, and then they will be able to bring this to whatever home institution they now work in. So to date, we are now in cohort 2. We've had approximately 200 fellows across 70 organizations in 4 countries that we're really excited about. We are getting ready to begin with cohort 3 as well, and applications will begin in the fall for cohort 4. So we encourage people as well, if you're interested, to please apply. But even from there, we thought that's still not enough. Because there's so much that needs to happen, including the bridge across K-12 to post-secondary, and we still need to get into the work of policy work and more systemic changes, because these courses are great, these activities will be great, but how do we really start to make more systemic change across not only institutions, but the greater computer science community? And so with that, we decided to form the Alliance for Identity Inclusive Computing Education, also known as ACE. ACE is an NSF-funded Includes Alliance. We are currently completing year 1 of that alliance with the goal of increasing the entry, retention, and course degree and completion rates of students from groups that are historically underrepresented in computing. Historically underrepresented, spanning from race, ethnicity, class, disability, sexuality, etc., and gender. So this is not just, again, race specific, but we recognize and understand wholeheartedly that you have to be able to tackle racial issues before you can tackle any of these other issues as well. Right now, that alliance uses a collective impact approach via the constellation model. That constellation model allows us to create new constellations which serve as umbrellas for categories of where work lies. So for example, our training constellation includes the 3C Fellows, but it also includes undergrad TA training that's happening by one of our partners at Mount Holyoke and soon to be Bard College. Curricula and pedagogy brings home all of these K-12 as well as post-secondary activities that are happening, courses, PD providers, and other things. So also I forgot to mention that in the training constellation on the K-12 arm, there are teacher inquiry groups and other training such as identity toolkits that are being developed for K-12 educators. Across research, we're collecting data on cultural competence, on undergraduate student perceptions of race and computing. We're really excited about that, which is a new project as well. And in addition, undergraduate degree and course entry and retention, as well as graduation rates, becoming or creating more disaggregated data. So including things like disability, which often are ignored in a lot of the data collection that you'll see on computer science graduates and professionals. And then the part that we're most excited about as well is policy, which under this arm includes K-12 policies such as curricula, standards development, and then also creating teacher advocacy groups and toolkits that they can use to then advocate for more identity inclusive policies and curricula at the state, local, and school level. But on the post-secondary side, we are working with CSAB, which is the ABET commission that's dedicated to computing, and making sure that ABET program and general criteria now include not only DEI and accessibility, but also providing strategies for departments to leverage these new requirements and create identity inclusive approaches to address them. So by doing all of this, we are hoping to create systemic change. And then across all of these, we are embedding and prioritizing disability as well, because again, it is one of those spaces that tends to be overlooked by the greater community as well as in CS education. So this is just a list of our current stakeholders, recognizing that all of these stakeholders are plugging into those 4 constellations I talked about. We will have new constellations that are born as new work comes about and new stakeholders are added. And in addition, some constellations may die out if, for example, we feel like there has been a mission accomplished moment. But there's so much work left to be done in computer science education that we know that those constellations will be around for a while. But you can see that we have a range of organizations right now, and this is only the member organizations that started with the founding of ACE. We continue to add member organizations. We continue to have affiliates who also plug into this alliance through without a memorandum of understanding. So they're doing work, for example, the 3C fellows who are creating these resources and courses at their institutions become affiliates of ACE, not members. But then they also have the option to join ACE as a member as well, to then lead or support some of these alliance activities under constellations. So we're really excited about the ways in which we are starting to think about systemic change. And in addition to all of this, we are guided and receive advice from not only our external advisory board, who includes experts in all of these areas, across education to industry, but also a student advisory board, which includes students from a range of STEM or STEM related disciplines, even into the social sciences, making sure that our students are guiding and serve as our kind of North Star to make sure we're on track with what we aim to do. So I'm back to this question around validation and are we doing the right job? And I said originally that we're not as a community, but we're trying to get there as an alliance. And we hope that what we do with ACE starts to serve as a blueprint for everyone in CS education and then in the greater STEM community for how we can make impactful change for students as well as faculty and staff from minoritized identities. But remember that in order to prepare students and graduates to do and be better, which is our ultimate goal, we have to make sure that educators are doing and being better. And in order to do that, we also have to make sure that we revise what we consider computing fundamentals. There's so much around the work that we do being theoretical that we ignore all of the qualitative and the societal impacts. So that has to be a prioritization in the fundamentals of computing now. Centering and decentering those who have been traditionally the experts, so which have been those from dominant identities. So if we look at racially, that includes people who identify as white, decentering them, and now centering those who have been the most minoritized, which traditionally is Black, Indigenous, and Latine. And by doing that, we get that unique positionality of people who have existed at the margins and have seen things with a wider lens, being able to provide better feedback and suggestions and strategies on how to make change. Acknowledging that impact won't look the same as it has before. It cannot be done traditionally as it has been done with H-index measures and other things that don't look at the holistic picture of what we consider impact. And then listening to Black women and ceding space to them. Again, I talked about from the beginning the original definition of outsiders within, how that's been applied to Black women in academia, even by Patricia Hill Collins herself, and how that is especially important in the computer science space. Cede space to Black women and listen to Black women and watch the change that happens as a result. So with that, I would like to say also that solving these problems will not happen overnight. And the same ways that we celebrate and invest in technology, innovation, and creativity, we need to do the same as a community. And this is something for industry as well to especially pay attention to. Celebrate and invest in those who are doing the innovative and creative work in DEI to create these kinds of systemic changes that we need. So with that, I'll say thank you as well. This is our website for the Alliance. We are also on Twitter as well as Instagram. Thank you so much for listening.
That was terrific. And apologies, everybody, for the sound glitches. She didn't actually go silent in real life, and the audio does exist. And if you go back to YouTube, you can hear all the audio that you missed, which hopefully wasn't too disruptive for your experience. Reminder that you can please pose your questions. You've got some praise coming in. You've got praise for your t-shirt, and you have praise for your course, which somebody says they've got some folks who've taken that course and they all speak incredibly highly of it. I want to start with the question that I know is on people's mind because they always ask this, which is, I want to be a good ally. I want to help lift that burden of DEI that's put on minoritized individuals. You talked about protection from colleagues and leadership, and I'm wondering if you could talk a bit about, for those who are watching who are mortified by the kinds of teaching evaluation type things, and I'm sure many of us witness those kinds of encounters in one way or another. What are the kinds of things that are most helpful for folks to do to be protective and create space?
So I thank you for that question, and thank you for having me again. I really appreciate it. I would say one of the most important things in that moment is to stop, shut up, and listen to the person who has been harmed. I think that people often want to help and say that I'm a good person and let me show you how. But they don't listen to the people who've actually been harmed and say, but you're still causing harm. And so it's really important to self-assess. You know, I talk about how I even had to do the same as a Black woman before I could do this work. And so if I had to do that, then every white person, especially white women, need to pay attention to that as well. You can't just show up in a space and say, I want to help and I'm going to do this. And you can't tell me that I'm not a good person. And we see that oftentimes because people are internalizing someone addressing an issue with something that they've done with reconciling, am I a good person in general? And we're not at that point. We just need you to listen and then be able to adapt so that you can do what we say we need done.
Are there sort of, I mean, I love that. I think listen is, we all need to be so much better at that in general. Yeah, and I do hope that this series has in general sort of provided 14 hours of good content to listen to. Are there kind of general things though, besides, don't be a jerk, or like if you're in a department where you're seeing a lot of these things, I think many people feel so helpless when they observe it, right? And they, and if we're not at Duke, we can't send folks to your class. So what do
I would say one of the first things to do is, to quote the late John Lewis, if you see something, say something, right? I've been in so many situations where things have happened in a department meeting and I'm the only person who spoke up. And then 5 people come to me afterwards and say, oh my gosh, you're so brave, you're so strong. Thank you for saying that. I was mortified. And I keep thinking, and I've said to them, well, if you felt like that, then why was I the only one speaking up? Why didn't you have my back, right? These are those moments when something is happening in the heat of the moment. If you feel like it is hard for you to address it, imagine how the person who's the recipient of it is dealing with it, because there are 75 different ways in which I could have addressed this. And I'm trying to find the one that doesn't paint me as an angry Black woman,
right.
That will still allow me to keep my job, right? And things like that. So when things happen, call them out. Say something at that point. And it can be as simple as, if you see someone making a problematic statement, ask them, I'm sorry, can you repeat what you just said so I make sure I heard you correctly? Because even in those moments, that means that person now has to double back down on whatever harmful rhetoric they just used. And they have to do it publicly while they know some people are acknowledging, we've seen and heard what you've said before. Documentation helps. When something happens, document it. Also help that person, provide that documentation and support, because it's often that person against a machine, and that machine may be a promotion and tenure committee, it may be a chair, some sort of supervisor, etc. So, and again, this is not just happening to colleagues. Your students are experiencing this. And so when we think about it in that case, are students comfortable coming to you if your students who are Black and brown, are they comfortable coming to you as a white person or even as a Black person, as a faculty member that they trust? And how can you create that space without asking them to now be tokenized for you or further harmed, right? In order to be a friend or have a friend, people say you have to be a friend, right? You have to make yourself trustworthy in order for people to trust you and share things with you.
Thank you. There's a follow-up from Denise Mendez, who says that she was Taken aback by your discussion of DEI work as a burden, and in her gut, she realized how true a statement it is and asks, do you have any advice for people doing the DEI work on how to help their leaders understand that burden?
Documentation helps a lot. I tell people, write down every activity you've done, the time it took for you to plan it and to implement it, and do that for a month, a semester, an academic year. Present that to leadership, and then let them see that this is what I have done. And this is in addition to what you've asked me to do, because a lot of times we are the ones who keep getting called to do things because people know, well, you know what you're doing, so can you help us with this? Also recognize in those moments when you're asked for help, you don't always have to say yes, right? Sometimes that means that things will have to crash and burn, and sometimes it just has to do it without you on board. But also recognize that when you're asked for things, be unafraid to ask for something in it as well, right? There needs to be something that's mutually beneficial. If it's compensation, if it's something else in terms of your career trajectory, whatever it is, I would love for people to be very comfortable for asking what they're worth.
Thank you. Good old Danae Ford Robinson's got a question here. She says, excellent talk, Dr. Nicki Washington. Thank you so much for being here. You mentioned in your talk that you and your team have been developing toolkits. Can you talk about how they are or can be adapted to academic flavored industries like Microsoft Research? Are they available online? And question number 2, how do you suggest that we connect large organizations like Microsoft Research with this work?
So to the first question, and hey, Danae.
Hey, Danae.
The first question, the Computer Science Teachers Association, CSTA, is working on those toolkits for K-12 educators. So those are coming in the form of small kind of Coursera-based web resources that will allow people to get foundational material, but then they're also turning a very aggregated version of the 3C Fellows into teacher inquiry groups for their chapters that are in local areas. So one piece is really just to give people a foundational understanding so that there doesn't have to be a lot of time wasted in the inquiry groups getting people up to speed. They are the point of contact for those. So if you're interested in that, I would suggest that you reach out to them to see how they're developing that. But also for the post-secondary and industry side as well, myself, Shawnee, and Cicely are also working on packaging up the 3C Fellows program in a more boot camp style for industry, so that it can be something that industry participants can engage in, recognizing that many industry members don't have the 2-year sequence and deliverables that would be expected, but we want them to understand this as well, because it does take time, right? You can't kind of 1 or 2 day DEI your way out of these problems, but we also want to recognize and appreciate people's time commitments and constraints. So I would say leveraging that point of contact, the email address for ACE at Duke is one of the great ways to understand how industry can start to plug in as well.
Awesome, thank you. I guess I want to wrap up with a question that probably is a great way to wrap up the whole series. I love that in your last slide you talked about rethinking computing fundamentals, and in a way that's kind of been part of this, the incentive for this whole thing is, hey, isn't this kind of fundamental to computing also? And I wonder if we might close out, I would love to hear you elaborate your thoughts on what the fundamentals of computing need to be.
Yeah, I start that with what they have been. So it's very much programming, algorithmic thinking, computational thinking, and then all of these other core areas that move into, for example, databases, networking, et cetera. But we miss a lot of times because we're worried about, again, ABET accreditation and that 120 hours of credits that we have to meet in terms of ABET. We lose all of the other social science courses and areas that are really have been sounding alarms in our community for a long time and have fallen on, ignored ears. And so for that reason, we have to find a way to better engage with and work with social scientists. We have to find ways to make our departments and our courses of study more interdisciplinary, not just across some of the sciences like biology and physics and chemistry, because I think that for the greater computer science community, you won't find a lot of argument from people that we need to understand those more, because that's still computational. I'm putting that in quotes for a reason. But we have to find a way to move into what has long been called, what I hate being called, the soft sciences, right? So all of these areas that look at the people and the approaches to humanity that are impacting everything we develop, because our students are asking for that. They're hungry for that. We have generations now who don't care as much about an algorithm as a step-by-step solution to a problem. They want a solution to the problems that are existing in the world around them. And we have to find a way to merge that algorithmic thinking with the societal impacts that we see. And that's not hard to do. The problem is it requires computer science faculty to let go of the arrogance that computing can solve every problem, and understand that there are a lot of problems that computing is creating. And I need to turn my attention to collaborating more with some of my colleagues in some of the social science and humanities, so that I can be not only a better researcher, but a better instructor, and more so a better person in general.
I don't even want to say anything, because I think those are the best words we could possibly end this whole series on. So thank you so much. That has just been fantastic. And thank you everybody who's been chiming in and watching and part of this series. And thank you everybody who's been made it all happen. Thank you so much. And we'll be sending out a survey in a bit, because we'd love to hear what you've taken from this series and how you're using it. So thanks so much, everybody, and we'll see you in our next big adventure together. Thank you.